And you mentioned Feldenkrais, and I think Moshe Feldenkrais was probably, in my opinion, as far as like somatic methods, the most far ahead of his time and still relevant to today, because he never told you, it wasn't like this westernized militant, like, I tell you what to do, this is the way. Even with Egoscue, it's like 90-degree angles. Like, this is the standard we hold the body to. It must be in this. Moshe Feldenkrais never told you to be any way. It was more of a learning experience, and you learned to write your own owner's manual. You learned and listened, and he never told you what to do. Is all experiential, and then you get to come up with your own solutions. And to me, that's the highest level of I think of any method or system, if you want to call it that.
That was Charlie Reid, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Before we get to the show today, I wanted to mention a really cool item that is available now from our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, in their store. That item is Exogen Premium Wearable Resistance. Exogen is a series of tight-fitting sleeves along with uniquely shaped fusiform weights that strap directly onto those sleeves. So what I mean is you can have shin sleeves, arm sleeves, shorts, and a vest, and you can strap these uniquely fusiform shaped weights that they're light in nature, 100, 200 grams, that strap on in a way that allows you not only to resist movement very specifically, but also add fine-tuned elements of rotation to that resistance. So this is the next level of wearable resistance. You may have heard this from back long ago on the show, Hank Kreinhoff talking about it, to recently Chris Corfis, sprint coach, talking about it. This is the next level in premium wearable resistance. I've used it myself. I love it. I love not only the way it feels and the way you feel form and technique change. It's like combining technique with power. And so often we just think about weighted vests as just pure force, pure downward gravity loaded resistance. This is the ultimate combination of technique with power, and it shows up in things like Chris Corfis being able to take time off an athlete's 10-meter fly by putting the sleeves just on one side of the body, an ipsilateral resistance. We're using the body's own systems, fine-tuning it, and that's what this does. It allows you as the coach or an athlete to create, explore, and fine-tune the way that the resistance is rotationally impacting the body. This is next level stuff, and I know you'll love it. So you can check that out in the Simply Faster store. Head on over to simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com, and get your Exogen gear today. Welcome to another episode. It's great to have you guys here. So Charlie Reid is a man I met at Pat Davidson's Rethinking the Big Patterns seminar. I lived in San Francisco for 8 years. I met a lot of really awesome coaches, trainers, and individuals there that really helped further my own growth as a coach and athlete and as a person. And Charlie was one of those individuals who you meet and you just realize that his knowledge and wisdom in so many schools of thought just goes so far. And right from the first time I met him, it's one of those things where not only does he know a lot, but he also just he's continually getting to the core of things, not just going and doing every seminar and workshop, but trying to find and formulate all those common bonds that are the principles, the underlying principles by which we actually do adapt to these means and methods. And there's a million of them out there. So Charlie himself is a movement educator, a coach, a massage therapist, even has experience as a professional musician. He is passionate about helping others reach their physical potential through smarter training, learning, and moving their bodies in the most efficient way possible. Charlie, as I said, has done an immense amount of continuing education and learning. And if you want to talk about any sort of system that's out there in the human movement and fitness field, Charlie should be on your short list to talk to. And so I actually had meant to do an in-person sit-down podcast with Charlie before I left San Francisco and moved to Ohio. That never happened, so I had to sadly settle for catching him online, but I'm really glad we were able to get together and have this chat. One of the things that Charlie and I felt would be a good conversation was, given his experience, was just getting to the core of these big systems in physical performance, rehab, conditioning, and kind of dissecting how it is that we actually do adapt to rehab means, to training means, or from anywhere from that rehab to high performance spectrum. What's the core of how we as humans adapt to that? Just kind of even cutting beyond the specific methods that are actually used. So within this too, it gives a unique perspective on what actually is corrective exercise. And we also start with some cool anecdotes on the show of just Charlie's experience with things like long duration meditation and the Egoscue method, which actually kind of have a little bit in common in some ways. So this was a really fun show with a really truly wise coach and someone I really enjoyed talking to with Charlie Reid. Let's get on to it. Episode 223. So you were just telling me about a silent meditation retreat, and I'm curious, what did you learn on that? And in the sense that you could relate it to just things that perhaps we do in the gym or in rehab or quote unquote corrective type work.
Yeah. I mean, a little bit of backstory. I toyed around with some meditation things, and I had done this thing called MBSR, which is mindfulness-based stress reduction. And it culminated in a one-day meditation retreat. And it was kind of like a collection of different mindfulness techniques. So you got a little bit of exposure to different things, whether that's yoga, walking meditation, sitting meditation, body scan meditation. But really the one-day retreat, which was 6 hours long, was like the most powerful thing for me. So, my brain was like, I want to do what's like the Navy SEALs boot camp of meditation retreats. And talking with some friends and colleagues and whatnot, they said, oh, the 10-day Vipassana you got to do that. And so my stepfather sadly had passed away in 2018, and I was like kind of in this existential crisis. And I decided that, this was the year that I was going to do this. So that's how I arrived. That's a little bit of the backstory there. But what's interesting, and I think for movement professionals, coaches, fitness professionals, we're such movement oriented people. So I'd say as it relates to movement and fitness, that we're taking some time to not move and just to sit is probably very, very challenging. At least it certainly was for me to be at this meditation retreat, having to, you're meditating for 12, 14 hours a day, and there's no talking. Your exercise is basically walking in between, hour-long or 2-hour-long sits. So that was probably the most fascinating thing to me, was kind of getting away from this idea of moving and starting to just sit with yourself. And also, as we were discussing just a moment ago, that, sensations in your body, physical sensations are transient a lot of times. They come and go. So they come and go into your awareness, and they're not always permanent. So maybe as it relates to something like pain, oftentimes sensations of pain that you would feel in your body, or if you define it as pain, are just a sensation like any other. And so you'll, for example, be sitting, and I would experience like incredible back pain. But if I would just sit there for long enough, oftentimes it would go away. And what actually made the pain worse was like trying to want to be somewhere else other than with the pain, which could be, a valuable lesson for people, because we just, as soon as we get the little slightest bit of discomfort, we're just like, ooh, we cringe and tighten up around the pain as opposed to softening around the pain. So those are just some of the many lessons I think that could be gleaned from that. But I'm sure everybody has their own experience and should have their own experience going through something like that. But yeah, it was a very, very cool experience.
Yeah, I think in our just general culture, we just don't tend to take much time, just period, for anything that involves prolonged time periods of sensing and just being forced to sit with ourselves. It definitely takes some intention to do that. Was this before or after me and you were hanging out at Kezar talking about extreme iso lunges? I forget.
That's a good question. I think it was afterwards, or it might have been right afterwards. Yeah, I can't remember. But I had been doing, like isometrics. That'd actually be interesting to see, like if I did like some isometrics beforehand and then did the 10-day sit and just see how the quality of that felt, or maybe I could sit with it for longer. But yeah, I can't recall.
I think there's a lot of things to be learned out of like just the extreme isometric lunge, holding a prolonged, full stretch lunge position for time. And I think one of the thoughts that has crossed my mind is, where is this pain coming from, or what is this? And actually, I should say the most extreme, probably maybe even more than extreme iso lunge, is just hanging from a bar, just straight up hanging from a bar. Because what are those? At least the hypnosis anecdotes would say this person got hypnotized and they could hold this bridge like indefinitely or whatnot, or the physiology that might say your slow twitch muscles really have a almost indefinite capacity to hang on or whatever. And where does fatigue start? with like central governor theory.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed this more when I'm having very poor days with hanging from a bar, where probably the last year more so. I used to, when I was rock climbing, I could easily go like over 3 minutes. And then the further I got away from that, I could still get over 2. But then days I couldn't get over 2 and I'm just like dying. I'm like, where is this coming from? Like, is it just strength? Like, am I mentally weak? Am I neurally weak? Like what is going on here? But I'll say too, like the extreme iso lunge is a good one where I'm like, what is this? Like, cause in coaching people on the extreme iso lunge for long enough, you realize that there's almost in some ways 2 kinds of people. It's never just 2, but there's the people who just don't even want to go into that stretch range because they know it's going to hurt. And so they just avoid it. And then there's the people who will, or basically you're the person who either goes down into the iso lunge or you're the person who goes up out of it. And I wonder if there's something to the person that goes into it and like being willing to sit with that, sinking into that discomfort, if you will.
That's interesting. I wonder if you could do like something where you could look at somebody's HRV score, for example, and correlate that with their ability to tolerate like long isometrics. You know what I mean? Like if you're that day, like you were mentioning, you're kind of using this as using the bar hang as a litmus test for how like, how well you're doing that day. Maybe if for some people that can, they're maybe a little bit too revved up on the sympathetic side of things. Maybe they just can't handle the isometrics that day. Or even something like breath hold times. Like if you're really, really stressed out, your control pause or your breath hold time would be less, and that can affect things too. And I think people that are really like super parasympathetic, maybe they can just sit there and handle the burn for longer. I don't know.
I haven't done a lot with HRV outside of myself, just a little bit, but I would bet you that there's a super close correlation between the HRV and the hang time. The podcast I just did with Leo Ryan, breathing specialist, not too long ago, he was saying that that's what he uses instead of HRV. And it makes me think like every time we're in the gym, like, what are we doing from an art form perspective that says we're skilled practitioners? Like looking at a phone or an app that says HRV does not take, I mean, you get better at it, but it's like, it's not as skilled as just teaching someone to breathe and understanding based off that. But perhaps a rougher form of a pure number would be just, hey, everyone hang from the bar as long as you can this morning. All right, let's write down your time. And I would do that, particularly with the water polo team that I trained at UC Berkeley, and because the assistant coach loved it too. It was a tough thing to do, and he really enjoyed that. And it was an easy way to get something very hard in and difficult without like destroying people, because you recover from it pretty quickly. We usually did it at the end though. It's kind of hard. I mean, if you think of the workout as a crescendo effect, like to come in and say, all right, like get on the bar, let's see. And you do it every day. That takes a little bit of mental energy. I'd be interested though. That would be, if there's anyone out there looking for like a master's thesis research or something or an idea, I think that'd be kind of cool. So if you end up doing it, let me know.
Totally. I think there's a lot to be learned about ways to ramp the system down. And I certainly see that, with meditation practice. I don't necessarily either think that meditation has to have a monopoly on this kind of stuff, but like there's something to be said for this like tabula rasa, this cleaning of the slate, and starting from a baseline, and maybe even just like cleaning house mentally or psychologically every year to start to appreciate greater levels of training. And maybe it's just not adopted as much. Again, I'm guessing here, but maybe it's just not adopted as much just because it's of the time constraints. Like, I'm thinking of athletes here, like, okay, everybody, we're going to go on a 10-day silent retreat. They're like, we actually got training to do,
Yeah.
But it's super fascinating. I'm curious to see if other coaches have implemented some of that stuff with their athletes at some capacity. I know we have apps like Headspace, I think is one of them, and people do like 10 minutes a day, but which I'm sure could have some benefit. But the difference between doing 10 minutes, like a 10-day sit it can be quite profound. And at least from my personality, I feel like I need to be hit over the head with a frying pan to really like feel something. And maybe some people can appreciate subtlety. I never got much out of doing just 10 minutes of an app, but I guess that's why there's something for everybody.
Yeah. Same here. It makes you think, well, what if you just did, you could look at doing an extreme isometric hold for that same amount of time. I'm curious what would happen in the brain waves, as actually, maybe I'm going to do that because I have the Muse headband, which it tracks, it's like an EEG or electroencephalogram and tells you where your brain waves are at. And so far, I've just used it for, as kind of I guess, meditation tool, though I'm so ADD. Part of me is just interested where my brain waves are at. If it's like low and you're getting into alpha, you hear the little birds and stuff like that. But maybe I'll do this. This will have to be a YouTube video or something, is just to see what happens the further. I feel like I might go the opposite way, like, way into beta or high beta and just like up cycle, like freaking out. Active meditation. We'll have to see what becomes of that.
Keep me posted. That sounds fun.
So with the sustained work, though, so like akin to maybe the meditation, I know you've been, and one thing we're going to talk about is just like, maybe we could just call them strong schools of thought in the fitness and performance industry.
Yeah.
Very strong schools of thought. But you were in the Egoscue for a while, which I think involves like long stretching periods of time. Could you explain a little bit about honestly, I don't even know that much about it. I have one client who uses it and seems to enjoy it. But I've always just kind of wondered, like, what good becomes of holding this long passive stretch for such a long period of time? And what's your take on that whole system?
Yeah, Pete Egoscue was a Vietnam war vet who had a tragic injury, and I think he shot his hamstring, and he came out of it in a lot of pain, and he was terribly crooked. And he just looked in the mirror one day, and this is folklore, so I'm getting the story kind of secondhand from one of his employees who I worked under. But he looked in the mirror one day and he's like, I'm crooked. And he tried to straighten his body up in a way that was anatomically correct. I'll put that in air quotes. And he tried to hold it, and it was very exhausting, and he fell out of it, but he noticed that he felt better. So we can call that an isometric, right? You're holding an isometric position. And so he went to the doctor and said, hey, doctor, I'm in a lot of pain. The doctor said, just take these drugs, whatever. I think this is in the 70s. And so he just grabbed the anatomy book out of the doctor's office and says, never mind, I'm going to figure this out on my own. So he kind of went on this journey to healing. And so he kind of got a hold of a lot of books and started doing his own research and experimenting and came up with this method. The method is centered around kind of what I would call very old school Florence Kendall era posture, 90-degree angles, straight lines kind of thing. And it obviously doesn't jive with my philosophy anymore of how the body functions, but that doesn't mean that I don't think it doesn't have some utility and doesn't help people. But there certainly are some features within the Egoscue system that I think are probably helpful for people, especially that are in pain. And we can talk about those things, but there's a lot of passive positioning and passive holds. So for example, they have an exercise called static back, where you're laying on your back and your legs are up and over a chair at 90 degrees at the hips and knees. And you just lie there and wait till your body just kind of settles into the floor. And if you stay there long enough, you can actually feel your lumbar spine kind of melting and flattening into the floor. So for those that have hypertonicity, or those that are in pain that have a lot of tension in their body, just sitting quietly and breathing, no matter what position you're in, could have some beneficial effects. He also has a lot of these long isometric holds, as you mentioned. And what we know from our understanding now from the literature, and as well as anecdotal experience, is that isometrics tend to have an analgesic or a pain relieving effect on the body, at least for some people. And that could be modulated biochemically from when you occlude a muscle as you're holding the contraction and you release that, you're kind of creating this hydrostatic pumping effect of new fluids. There's a change in a sensory change within the cortex. So we know that from the tendinopathy literature that isometrics can have an effect on the feedback loops in the body and helping to decrease sensitivity. I know from Ebony Rio and colleagues in Australia, they talk a lot about tendinopathy and how it's almost like you have a foot on the brake and the gas at the same time. And so maybe it can kind of reset that system a little bit. And again, that's probably a crude definition. It's neurophysiology is probably much more complex than that, but I'm gonna work with that for now. And also, there's a powerful relationship between the practitioner and the client. So Egoscue was very unique in the way that they talked to clients and the way that they communicated with them. And I don't think that gets enough credit either. So there's many different factors that inform the therapeutic process that I think were valuable. And so that's why I think people probably do well. But I don't necessarily think it's because we got people to be more aligned posturally. You know what I mean? Posture is such a transient thing. It changes minute to minute, hour to hour. You know what I mean? So yeah, those are my initial thoughts anyway.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to unpack. It makes me think about the origins of that. Make me think of Moshe Feldenkrais and how he figured his stuff out a lot by I think he tore his ACL and was trying to not walk it off, but trying to figure out how to function on it and try to make a way around it. But I like what you say, because I've been to enough different systems where there's always, not always, but like a lot of times it's, hey, here's this person who has a problem. Okay, come up here and let's, do a few things, whatever it is, press here, massage here, work here, breathe this way. And then we test again and now you're, better or whatever. And I guess to me, that's Egoscue actually is probably maybe the opposite of that in a sense, because you're just sitting there a long time. But like you said, there's other things happening. And that's really what I want to get into, is what are like these global ideas that can really almost be expressed in all these different methods, so to speak. And so the first, you said just being more parasympathetic, I believe, was one of the things that you were talking about, or just like just breathing there. Like if you were just to sit and breathe and just be mindful, or instead of necessarily being in a stretched position. Or I'm curious what your take is on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the same argument made for acupuncture. When we do studies on things like this, do you have a good control group? Like, how do you know it's the needles, or how do you know it's not that somebody just gets to be with their thoughts for an hour, or is not doing something that could potentially harm them? So in the case of Egoscue, if you're spending an hour a day doing something that's passive and relaxing, and not doing something maybe that's insidious to your body, that's causing more provocation of symptoms, then you know what I mean? So maybe it's just avoiding the bad thing that's making things better, right? And also we know that it could just be the passage of time that makes you feel better. Like the body is a self-healing organism. And so maybe just the passage of time helps that too. Now, I will say that I think there's probably two of the most common reasons why bodies probably get better. And I guess you can, extrapolate this into both pain and performance, is just novelty and graded exposure. So the body is being exposed to something different and interpreting it in either a favorable or non-favorable way. And then graded exposure, of course, is you're just exposing yourself to greater and greater levels of stimulus until the body adapts, hopefully, and you get stronger, if you want to call it that, or more resilient, or whatever. And you mentioned Feldenkrais, and I think Moshe Feldenkrais was probably, in my opinion, as far as like somatic methods, the most far ahead of his time and still relevant to today, because he never told you. It wasn't like this westernized militant, like, I tell you what to do, this is the way. Even with Egoscue, it's like 90-degree angles. Like, this is the standard we hold the body to. It must be in this. Moshe Feldenkrais never told you to be any way. It was more of a learning experience, and you learned to write your own owner's manual. You learned and listened, and he never told you what to do. Is all experiential. And then you get to come up with your own solutions. And to me, that's the highest level I think of any method or system, if you want to call it that. It shouldn't even be a method or a system. It should just be you experiencing the world and finding your own path.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, that's where my coaching has certainly gone. And I think even just on some level, innately, that's always been there with me. Is even, I remember when I, as a young track coach, 24, 25, 26, I realized really quickly that just saying, do this with a limb, get to this position with a limb, never really did anything. And so it was always trying to get an athlete, like in javelin, instead of saying, hold your arm here and go throw it again. Like that's which every other coach would usually do. That in my comfort scenario, at least, they would say, oh, you need to do this with your arm, this with your leg, this with your hip. And I would just be like, all right, tell my athlete, hey, I want you to do this drill and feel this stretch, about 5 or 10 times, and then go through again. That just made sense to me. It just, and honestly, I probably was more technical than that. I probably told them some positions in the drill, but whereas now I think it would be tried to make it more sensory oriented and feel this and those types of things. But I
don't think it's bad either. I mean, I'm not, that's not to say that I don't judge people for being a little bit more constraining about how they teach, or being more rigid about some. And you can tell me what you think about this too, but I think it's important to meet people where they're at. And, when you create more constraints for learners, sometimes it's better just to give some structure at first, right? Like you can't go to a 5-year-old necessarily, unless they're maybe a savant, and you say like, all right, we're going to talk about the javelin. And then you just say, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to have you experience the javelin. You know what I mean? Like then you end up kid throws a javelin at some other kid or something. I don't know. I don't teach kids, so it's probably not a fair analogy for me to comment on that. But yeah, sometimes you have to have rules, but then over time, hopefully, as our understanding grows, that we start to release those constraints and break the rules a little bit and become a little bit more experiential. But that's also a scary place to be and can be frustrating for some people. And I understand in a commercial model, when you're trying to sell a product, sometimes it's nice to be so certain about things and create this rigidity, because it gives people confidence to deal with a problem that's scary. And the reality is that the world is a very vast and uncertain place. And so sometimes providing some peace of mind through uncertainty just helps people to sleep at night, But you and I know as coaches, it's like none of us know what we're looking at, and the body is incredibly complex. But hopefully, I have some ideas that can move us in a direction that's going to be good for you.
Yeah, I like that, because I will say I like how you drew that distinction out, and I think of it as the highest order of coaching is really just having, you think a lot like a cheetah. Cheetah doesn't need anybody to tell it what to do. It just does what it is, and it's an environment. It's perfect. It's perfection. No one could coach. When you see those slow motion of a cheetah or anything like the bobcat jumping 10 feet and landing on a rock, nobody's going to be able to coach that animal to do that thing any better than it's doing. It's impossible. That is perfection. And so it's like, well, now where did things go wrong with us? Do we have a bigger, part of our brain that screws it all up? And, in our development, do we miss steps? Do we miss fundamental skills? Do we not move enough? Do we get hurt? Do we wear bad shoes? Are we too, hard on ourselves from a pain and punishment perspective, and we use more will than we need to? And I don't want to go on with that too much, but I've seen it in coaching where a coach may be trying to get an athlete to feel something the way a child might feel, but the athlete just wants, just tell me where to put this limb. I need a position to anchor, So I think the ultimate is if we can just explain things without having to say, talk about positions and put this limb here and feel this muscle. But it's almost like you said, like there's like a bridge maybe to get there for a lot of people. And I think that is important, because I think being around track mates enough, I would say for every probably one person that you can see is out there feeling a rhythm, feeling the movement, feeling their body, there's probably 5 or 10 who are just trying to find a position the coach told them to do, And it's like we want to be like that, more like that person over time. And there is also the idea of I think people make the straw man on the learner-centered approach, saying, oh, it's just a free-for-all. Well, I think it's a little bit more. There's more to it than just that, like as you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the best coaches that I've had the privilege of watching, they have groomed their athletes over time to become more autonomous and to seek out the coaches to continue their own development, as opposed to the coach just being a more autocratic and telling them exactly, like a dictator, like you need to do this, 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 this. So I think it probably means at the higher level of sport and performance that there's more autonomy on the part of the athletes, and it's less about kind of telling people what to do.
Yeah, at some level, I was talking with a coach about this last year, is on some level, I almost wonder if each of us could be a coach in virtually any sport. Like if I could, I'm not very good at golf, but if I could coach golf, and I don't know much about golf either. I know a little bit about rotation, but I'm I'm not a genius at it by any means, but I almost wonder, like, could I go be a good coach for a golfer just by sequentially directing their attention, just say, hey, just place your intention on what this joint's doing and this is doing, and not, and just see what happens. I feel like I end up doing that a lot in the skills that I do know anyways. And so I wonder how far that could take some people, or if you just started there and saw what happened and then you started feeding in, okay, well, here's a image of a similar golfer doing this and whatever. But I kind of wonder how far that could take some people before they'd run into roadblocks.
Yeah, that's interesting. Also considering the environment too. So let's say you took your approach, Joel's experiential golfing academy, right? and then you got some guy, super biomechanist golfing guy, we'll call him.
Yeah, super biomechanist golfing guy.
Yeah, and he looks super sciencey, and he has these rules, and so you might be out of business, Joel, because your approach, for example, might be better for the learner long term, but maybe this biomechanist guy gets results in the short term. So I understand the pressures and the appeal of these shaved apes, these humans that appear more confident than they are about something, and how the general public really looks for that confidence to get better, right? even though, you might think in your mind, well, no, I've seen that approach and I understand it, but really long term, this more experiential model is probably going to be better for you. But again, people are going to be drawn to, and that's really largely a problem of our industry too. We have largely a consumer driven industry. So the consumer really drives who gets the dollars a lot of times. And that can be frustrating.
Yeah. I think if you are like if I'm going to do a tennis lesson for a kid or something, I can't, as a parent, going to pay me if I just show up and I'm like, hey, well, I think about tennis. I think about Timothy Galway, inner game of tennis, like just work very learner centered, like just pay attention to how the ball feels. What does it sound like? What's the rhythm versus trying to coach a hard line position or whatnot versus Brad Gilbert. Someone directed me to this after I had been kind of putting out anecdotes from inner game of tennis, and he was saying, well, Brad Gilbert, who wrote Winning Ugly, I think Brad Gilbert was top 10 in the world in tennis at some point, and wrote a very technical, Christian Tito would call him a type 3, like a very analytical, structural book on how to like be a very structured. And people would say this guy's technique is not very pretty, but he's just tactical. And so, well, what if we could have the best of both worlds? What if that guy could have had a more, because obviously his form was not good because it was probably very rigid and there was a very strategical will-centered person in there trying to, and it clearly worked in that way. I'm just always interested what is the balance in these things. And I do think too about a study I've been aware of for a while was I don't know who did it, but Franz Bosch highlighted it because I know Franz Bosch, really big like motor learning and human skill acquisition guy. And it was two groups of throwers. And I think they were fairly high level, like fairly decently trained. And one group just went and they just threw the discus or whatever. And all they got was feedback of how far it went. That's all they knew. How far did this go? And then the other group had a coach like coaching them up and teaching them what to do. And the group that I believe this is like 99% sure this is what happened, but the coached up group did a little bit better in like the short term, like the first few weeks. But then as the weeks went on, that group that just had the feedback of results and that's it, eventually eclipsed because all these coaching cues were just biomechanical shortcuts. I had this idea there that these are all hacks. I was listening to health and well-being podcasts where they were talking about like hack is the common word for everything. Like, and I always kind of hated that. I don't know why. Like
me too. It's the Tim Ferriss syndrome, the 4-hour athlete, right?
Yeah. It's like something's wrong. So here's a quick Band-Aid to slap over it, but you're not getting to the core of what's going on. And so I think that can be the same thing with coaching cues and mechanics is, hey, here's something that's wrong. Let me give you a position to maybe fix it and maybe get you ahead for a few weeks or months. But this isn't what your system is meant to do from its purest form. It's like that you're not letting that supercomputer that's coordinating all these reactions and balances and levers do what it, I think, ultimately is meant to do. And so that it does make me think, well, what would be the balance there between, because I'd imagine that group that just got to do whatever and then only had the distance was probably coached formally they had to have been coached formally on some level prior to that. So it's an interesting conversation. I know we were going to talk about corrective stuff, and I'm trying to think about where that fits with that. So maybe I'll just ask you this: is what's your take on corrective and rehab, and where that structured versus learner-centered approach fits with someone who's in pain or someone who has suboptimal air quotes here posture or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm less and less of a fan of the term corrective. I know that's kind of a popular word, but I think language is important. And I don't even know if what we're really doing is correcting anything, because I think about this a lot in regards to what we think we're doing with these corrective exercises. Really, they're just low force, very mindful, inner centered exercises to generate some awareness around something. Or maybe like I talked earlier about graded exposure. Maybe you're just doing a movement at a low enough level that's not painful until their body can build themselves up in order to do the things that they want to do with their body. So I'm not against the exercises themselves. I think they're just different ways of engaging somebody's, psychophysiology, for lack of a better term, and getting them to start moving again. And so I think any movement really can be quote unquote corrective, but really I think it's just the way that they're implemented and what do they fold into. Shane Parrish has a great book called The Great Mental Models. He talks about the second order thinking in the book. And so that is, where does it go? So I'm always asking the questions, okay, you're doing let's say a side clam for your glute medius. Well, where does that go? Show me where that goes. Not that I'm against a side clam necessarily, but you have to show me where that eventually is going to lead to. So I always ask, and then what? And if I can't think in my mind, where the side clam is going to lead to, then I'm probably going to take that out of the order of exercises. And I think that's a problem within the continuum from rehab to performance, is that we have this rehab oriented style of movement to help somebody to either modulate pain or to start the process of increasing capacity in an area, all the way to performance, where we're running, jumping, sprinting, kicking, lifting, whatever that activity is. And then there's this chasm in the middle. And you can't tell me that a side clam is going to make the leap into sprinting and putting multiples of your body weight on your structure. So I don't know if that answers your question, but long story short is that I don't really love the term corrective exercise. I just look at it as gradations of movement.
So yeah, a spectrum of two different opposite poles, one being pure, maybe sensation, I guess, on the joint level, like the small joint and proprioceptive level, all the way up to giant, like gross, explosive motor movements. And yeah, to think of it as, just one big giant like spectrum, I think is cool, because it's like, oh, you're good. You can go to the gym and just totally crush it and get full sympathetic, fight or flight. And to think that there's no elements of perhaps the complete opposite polarity, where there is like a level of sensation and understanding of your body. And maybe that's why the martial arts, that's one thing I want to get into more, but like, from my understanding, the martial arts combines those worlds well, where there's that inner understanding and the body awareness, and you're combining that with the power. It's almost as if, again, I've never done it, so I can't speak to it, but you're just reading some books, like just reading a book on Bruce Lee really or I think it was like, I think The Warrior Within was, but yeah, I like that. So based off you said, where are we going? So let's just say if we're on these polarities and someone is more of I'm in pain, I need something fixed and changed so I can get onto the higher end of the polarity. Where do you start? Like, what is your starting point with that issue in terms of giving them something to help them on their way?
I think you should always start with what their intentions or their goals are, and figure out what those movements are and what the demands are. And then really it sounds simple, but you want to observe their activity and see what they're doing before you start applying tools, right? So obviously somebody that is just looking to, because again, I'm not trying to author their own life for them. I'm just trying to understand what they want to do. And sometimes it's not always clear. They're not always clear with what they want to do. Like for an athlete, like a sprinter, for example, their demands are obviously going to be much higher than somebody that just wants to go hiking or walking, right? So you consider the demands of their activities, and then you say, okay, well, if you want to sprint, I know that you're going to have to handle multiples of your body weight on one leg. And so there's some prerequisites there, I think, that are going to have to take place before you get there. But I always try and always go to the whole first before I start breaking out the constituent parts. And I know there's different philosophies on how people will break that out. Some people will start from the parts and build up to the whole. I personally just have never found that approach to be a good use of time. And if I can see that they can accomplish the whole part, then I don't see the necessity of having to do, these specialized corrective exercises necessarily. And I've had many conversations about coaches. It's a really interesting conversation to have, but even things like, we use things like glute bridges, and I'm listing off some classic, corrective exercises that people will do. Whereas if I can see somebody do just a march in place and they can get adequate hip extension and achieve the positions that are appropriate, then I think I don't see the need to necessarily keep doing low level activities. Now, so I guess I also could say that I will do corrective exercises, quote unquote, corrective exercises if I have to, but only if I have to. If it means that it keeps somebody moving, then I'm in favor of doing that. Do you view things similarly as far as corrective exercises for yourself and your athletes? Or do you kind of take a different slant?
That's a good question. Well, I'll just say, as far as I go with correctives, to me, correctives are more, I think a good illustration is, for me, is I like Austin Yoakum, who's been on this podcast, had an Instagram post that I think it fits with my ideology pretty well. Is he showed like an athlete doing a lateral lunge in the warm-up. Like, here, we're doing a lateral lunge. And then he showed that another athlete playing spike ball, basically doing a dynamic lateral lunge to spike the ball in space. and how much more is going on from a coordination perspective in that lateral lunge to go spike the ball than just, oh, the coach said just do this lateral lunge. You know what I'm saying? So I'd rather cater towards the more coordinative demand, the better. The more coordinative demand you can handle, the better. And so I like using like the Marvin Marinovich, like the physio ball stuff. Probot X is a good spectrum. They have stuff from like the low level, just simple stuff with these water bells or your body, all the way up to dynamic and reversible. And so a lot of my movements rely on that on the lower level. If an athlete is in pain, I like the idea of, well, let's give you sensation where you don't have it, and then let's move. And ultimately, it's let's move. Let's move the body and let's explore spaces, like you said. Let's explore sensations and let's get joints to move. And just by getting joints to move and just moving your body, I feel like it's as simple as that. Be it FRC, shoulder cars, or my go-to for the lower body has been Gary Ward's wedges. I mean, just total magic just by moving and opening up joints, and ultimately like the body kind of working as intended. I'm getting long-winded, so I'm going to stop you here. But how can I get the body as close to moving as intended, meaning, pronation, supination, joint spirals, all joints are moving, and then exploring that space as tolerated, and then increasing the coordination demand over time as I can. I hope that, I just kind of put that together in my head, so hopefully it makes sense.
No, I would agree with you. And I would say, going back to my 2 points about novelty and graded exposure, I think sometimes a lot of these exercises are just ways of injecting novelty so the body can start interpreting positions and movements differently. And that may inform the whole, or maybe at least allows them to feel better, or maybe feel like they're in less pain when they're doing an activity. And do we really know why it's working? I don't know. You know what I mean? I don't think we really know or can know a lot of these things, but I think there's a reason why we have a lot of options for movement, and there's so many systems that are born out because they probably all work at some level. And having a collection of tools is probably going to be helpful, even if we don't necessarily know the reasons why they're working. There's a very good chiropractor and physical therapist, Greg Lehman, up in Canada, and he calls it building shit up and calming shit down. So very simply, I love it because it's such a distillation. It's so simple. It takes things that are incredibly complex and makes it very simple. And essentially he says, you're either calming things down, so that's decreasing pain or threat, or you're building stuff up. So you're increasing the capacities of the body to be able to handle forces, be able to handle load. And so I think at the base level, even if it's kind of a reductio ad absurdum, I'm making a assumption, probably making things too simple. At some level, we're probably just calming things down and building them up.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, it's like there's that. If I realized anything, Matt Cooper said this on this podcast, and I thought it was funny, but it's like it's very woke sounding to talk about the nervous system. But to me, that's how complex is. I mean, the nervous system is so complex. It's like, I think it's going to be the last thing that if we ever really figure it out, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, so to just kind of give it up to that complex thing, it solved it. Whatever I did helped the nervous system to solve this problem. And I know, for me, even just getting into like, just using like DC current and the ARP wave and stuff, and just seeing how the electrical resistance of the body changes based off of either using the machine itself or certain exercises, and then going back to the machine and seeing what happened, what changed. It's just, it's just like, we can almost always just try to find what got us close. I know you do massage as well. I mean, I imagine that has helped you understand also, perhaps, or give some insights as to how this whole thing fits. Because I'm sure being able to put your hands and get in the tissue and understand things on that feeling level, I've heard that too. Like, oh, the tissue changed based off this input. And how has being a massage and body worker helped you understand? I guess, not corrective, but just that end of the spectrum.
I just think it's given me another layer and another set of tools again to encourage movement and allow an experience of movement that's maybe less threatening. So again, do I really know what's going on in massage? No, I don't. But I do know that sometimes doing some manual work for people helps to decrease threat, if you want to call it that, or help them to just feel better from a sensory perspective, and then they can start moving more. And I think there may be some things you can glean from just putting your hands on somebody, just about how they hold tension or how they, how their joints move and things like that. But I think a lot of massage therapists and manual therapists make a lot of assumptions about things that may or may not be true. And I kind of went down that rabbit hole pretty hard when I was going through my massage program and taking, courses, and people are talking about how they're, communicating at the cellular level with this, and they're changing fiber alignment with their hands. And, I would say I'm pretty skeptical of that claim. But that being said, I also don't think I still think it's useful, or can be useful in the right context at the right time. And also, people just appreciate it. I think there's so much bashing going on with manual therapy, at least in the, in the physical therapy world and the performance world, I think. And there's nothing wrong with just helping people feel better. You know what I mean? Like, why does that? I know there's a big flame out with those massage guns. People are like, oh, they don't do anything and blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, but if people feel better, like they're not hurting anybody. I mean, unless you're causing like massive contusions or bruising and stuff. And
like those huge, gigantic rollers.
The rumble rollers or the fascia blasters. And anything that has a name like a fascia blaster, I'm probably not going to subscribe,
Yeah, I'm on the same wavelength with the Theraguns, because I first saw them and I'm just thinking, oh, this is stupid. This isn't actually doing anything to the fascia or whatever it's supposed to do, right? And then, but I'm like, these wouldn't be popular if they didn't help people feel better. Like, if they didn't help people feel better, why would you use it? And I remember someone had one, and I was like, my leg's sore, I'll try it. And I was like, oh, that does feel a lot better. Like, this is great. I'd use this.
And you also look at the people that use them quite a bit, not to throw CrossFitters under the bus, but like I see a lot of the CrossFit community using these intense massage devices. And I'm thinking to myself, why would they gravitate towards that? And I'm thinking, well, CrossFitters spend a lot of time doing very intense exercise. And if you've ever, as a body worker, worked on CrossFitters, they're like, their whole body is like incredibly hypertonic. They're just, and that's not a judgment. It's just how they want to operate in their world, but it probably feels really good to just massage things. And so you could say like, oh my God, your whole body's hypertonic, you need to relax. And it's like, well, it's not my job to tell you how to live your life. So if massage makes you feel better, there's a reason that people gravitate to the things that they do. And that's, independent of me and what I think you should do. And I think that's the problem of the ego within what we do, is you have coaches and trainers wanting to tell other people what to do. And I think we should just start with the position of understanding, and then let the person make the most informed decision for themselves that they can, not me as an expert trying to tell you what to do. If you want to do a backflip off of a cliff with a chainsaw on your teeth, then go for it. It's not my job to tell you what to do or not to do. Hopefully I would just be able to, provide a perspective for you about the alternative, or maybe some other choices that might be more favorable for you. So
I like the CrossFitter example because it makes me think about, as the roller, I can't remember the name of the roller, but it's Donnie Thompson, I think invented it, who squatted like 1,300 pounds, and the roller weighs like 100 some pounds. And it's like, well,
the body tempering, I think is what it's called. Yeah.
yeah. And I had heard a story about like, cause it's like, okay, as soon as this guy does this, oh, this is the most hardcore way to roll, and but like, that stuff could like kind of mess you up. I think I'd even heard some stories of like some small scale, like, injuries or soreness that was the result of, anything you can do too much, right? Like the tool that it feels good for a huge guy that squats 1,300 is maybe not the tool that you should be using. I don't know. I'm sure there's people it's good for. And again, it wouldn't sell if people didn't like, if it only worked for him and no one else, it wouldn't sell. So clearly it works for somebody. But I do think that's interesting that the tools we gravitate towards, it's almost like, the as above, so below type mentality. It's just, you work like this. But I don't know, on some level, you almost wonder if maybe you should draw some extremes that are bigger. If you work really hard, you should rest really hard, or I don't know. It's areas to explore.
Right. Well, and then, where does it go? So what's the logical end there, or illogical end? So you have these body tempering devices that are 200 pounds. Well, what's the next step? You're going to put your arm under a steamroller? Like, I don't.
They'll really get the fascia. Will get the fascia.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So. I think at some point you should ask where it's going. And also, you've probably seen this with some athletes that like fall in love with the foam roller. Like, you should ask some questions about like, well, if you're feeling the need to have to foam roll half an hour before every workout, let's talk about maybe what's going on, and maybe we
Hmm.
can save you some time on not having to feel like you need to do that. Because sometimes it's just a belief.
Yeah.
It's just an idea that somebody, implanted in their head, or that they adopted from somebody else. Maybe they saw another athlete doing this and like, oh, I just need to do it. I see that largely in the endurance community. They tend to do like these rehab exercises that they did 10 years ago, in addition to lots of foam rolling, as kind of as a form of an insurance policy, because they're trying to avoid injury. But as you and I know, foam rolling and doing, low level exercises, is no guarantee that you're going to avoid injury. In fact, you're probably just wasting your time. I'd rather have you just go home and take a nap or go eat or something, you know? So that's the tragedy of the story, is that people feel like they have to do it, even though they don't need to do it. So
Yeah.
that's where us as professionals can help others to put the pieces together for themselves, and avoid, and to really save them time, especially in a world like ours where people are starved for time as it is.
Yeah, for sure. I know I definitely got away from that habit of just feeling like I had to foam roll. And and part of it too is just learning how to move and train more intelligently
Right.
prevents you from feeling messed up as it is, just moving your body more naturally and just understanding yourself more in the warm up too, learning to move better in the warm up to create the same effect that you would have gotten from a roller. I'm not saying a roller can't. I had a really good experience working in person with Rocky Snyder down in Santa Cruz not too long ago, where he would selectively use it and use a
Hmm.
neurological test to then see if this is in fact actually helping you for this muscle group. But it was not at all a, hey, just roll your muscles out type thing, because this is that which most people do.
I would say too, about 80% of the, if I had to put a number on it, about 80% of the issues that people have are really related to, as you said, just errors in training, improper load management, doing things that are above their pay grade, not training at the right intensity and the right frequency. Those are all issues that need to be addressed on an educational level. And especially working on bodies, bodies tell a story sometimes. And one of those stories could just be like I was mentioning about the hypertonic CrossFitters, like it could just be that they're tight all the time because they're really pushing themselves very hard, and maybe they're not providing enough of a deload or whatever it needs to be in order to allow them to adapt. Maybe.
Mhm. So, as you mentioned, you were talking about doing work, like observing the person first before you start assigning these things that help them to move better, get out of pain. And you've been through a lot of systems, Egoscue, PRI, Feldenkrais. I feel like we've met it. Maybe it wasn't PRI. It was Pat Davidson's seminar where you and I first met, not PRI. I know Pat has a
Mhm.
experience with PRI as well. But so the synthesis of these methods and means, do you have any themes that really tend to resonate when you're working with somebody from the ground up, if you will, or trying to find that linchpin? I mean, I doubt you're cranking out the clamshells and monster band walks. Where has this kind of landed you a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's hopefully getting more and more simpler. We were talking about approaching this fitness singularity at some point. Like that would be a
Mhm.
wonderful goal for us, to just the one exercise that does it all.
That's what I'm always
It's a
asking. Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
last
yeah, yeah.
question on this whole
I'm I'm
every time.
I'm waiting for it. Nobody's found it yet. Honestly, it gets a lot simpler for me. I've been really interested lately in understanding kind of different physiological stereotypes, meaning or somatotypes. So like different bodies. I think we have a lot to learn. I certainly have a lot to learn about different individual response to things, right? And so you have somebody like, an ectomorphic female that might respond really well to strength training. That might be the linchpin that changes her world. Whereas if I have somebody that is, like a power lifter type that's, really muscular, but maybe they need a little bit more aerobic work in their life to just feel better and recover better. So I'm always interested in kind of like filling these buckets for people, and just seeing based on what they want to do and what they want to accomplish, and where some buckets might need to be filled. And often what I find is people, we like to do what we're good at, of course, right? Like we're naturally inclined to do what we enjoy doing, which is wonderful. But sometimes taken to an extreme, we're avoiding the things that allow our body to function the way it should. And so that recipe is going to look a little different for different people. But, I would say my system, if I had a system, is not that complicated. It's really centered around understanding good movement, whatever that is for the person, fundamental movement skill and coordination, just the ability to learn how to squat and hinge and do a push-up. These are all basic foundational physical literacy things. And then, I'm a big fan of, at least in the general population, of just very simple strength training. I think strength training does a ton of things for people, and it doesn't have to be complicated. And as far as what it looks like, I'm not beholden to any one style of loading. I want to load people's bodies. And that has several reasons: structural, hormonal, even from a movement standpoint. To me, strength training can be loaded mobility. You can get increases in range of motion just by getting stronger in greater ranges. And so I think it doesn't have to be too complicated. And then, of course, from a health standpoint, I want to make sure people are doing things that encourage cardiovascular health and aerobic fitness, which is correlated with cardiovascular disease. So those are all important things as well. That's kind of my overarching theme. I know that was kind of broad in general, but that's kind of the paradigm that I operate under. Do you move well? Are you strong? And do you have, a healthy heart and lungs? And then if you want to get specific as far as sport performance, then now we're talking about titrating down into more of a specific format. And sometimes that'll lead us further away from health. But those are decisions that ultimately have to be made by the athlete, not by me. I'm just there to be a sounding board, or I like to say I'm a stem cell for your dreams. So you just tell me what you want to do and we'll just plug and play.
I like that. Where's respiration and breathing landed in all this for you?
It's fundamental. So I would put that in kind of the fundamental movement category. There are many different ways to breathe. I certainly learned from the DNS courses and also through PRI about respiration as it relates to movement. Finding a punctum fixum, as DNS calls it, or a zone of apposition for PRI has been big for me. So I start that with all my people, learning how to get a rib cage stacked over a pelvis and to really start from that position as they're moving. So that's certainly important from a movement standpoint. I honestly don't, even though I've taken like Wim Hof breathing, I've taken Buteyko courses, I think they all have some great stuff in there. I honestly don't spend a lot of time with it, only because of the context that I'm in. I'm kind of a movement professional. So I tend to guide breath more around stuff as it relates to improving people's movement. So that would be more stuff in like the PRI world, the DNS world, less about the Buteyko or the oxygen advantage kind of thing. But I might encourage a client to explore that further if it's something that's going to help them with their life, whether it's helping them to ramp their system down, help with anxiety or whatever it is. Or maybe I'll refer them to somebody to get that work done for themselves. But yeah, breathing is huge. It's so important. And it tells you a lot about people and how they move when they're, holding their breath or fixing in any kind of way while they're moving.
Yeah, there's a lot of really cool observations that can be made when someone's holding their breath. I've learned.
Yeah. Their coordination just falls apart, right? I mean, unless you're a power lifter trying to squat 1,000 pounds or whatever, breathing is such an important part of movement. So it should be emphasized.
Well, right on, man. Well, hey, I think we're just about an hour, and I think we just about got through our list, man. So
Nice.
We'll leave it at that. And it was really good talking to you, Charlie, man. I just always love the way your mind works and the way you see things. And it was really cool, especially the corrective exercise and how that filters up through the explosive end. I'll definitely be thinking about that, man. So appreciate your thoughts, your insight, and appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. Hope it was helpful for your listeners.
All right, that wraps up another show. Thanks for being here with us. If you'd like the show and enjoy what we're doing, you can help us out by leaving us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, whatever you're listening to. It helps get the word out of this show and helps those people who might be interested in it to find it. Before we leave, I wanted to give a last shout out to our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, suppliers of high-end training technology, data and non-data training tools. So things like you want bar speed tracking, you want force plates, you want timing systems, they got it. You want training equipment like K-Box or blood flow restriction, they have that too. They've been a long-time sponsor of our show, and we are really appreciative of them supporting us. All right, that does it for this week. We'll see you guys next one.